Welcome. Today we're digging into something foundational, handing you a kind of historical map, really. We're charting the origins of artificial intelligence and cognitive science.
That's right. We're looking at those early, often philosophical questions, the conceptual fault lines, and the engineering leaps that shaped the field,
Yeah.
especially that key period leading up to about 1996.
Yeah, the idea is to unpack those classic AI approaches, from symbolic logic all the way to neural networks. We're trying to find those aha moments, right? How did researchers first try to pin down intelligence and build thinking machines?
And it's fascinating because the field was interdisciplinary from the get-go. You can't ignore the work of someone like Warren McCulloch, psychiatrist, physiologist, even a poet, teaming up with the mathematician Walter Pitts back in the 40s.
Right, that McCulloch and Pitts paper is legendary.
It really is. It laid down the mathematical basis for how nerve cells could, in theory, perform logical operations. That groundwork was crucial for both the symbolic and the connectionist camps later on. AI's DNA was mixed from day one.
Okay, so let's dive straight into that split then. Because the sources make it clear, AI pretty quickly divided into these two sort of rival visions. First up, the classical view, the symbol system approach.
Hmm. This was the dominant idea initially, championed by giants like Newell and Simon.
Uh,
Their core belief was, essentially, that the brain operates like a very sophisticated computer program. Thinking is manipulating symbols according to rules.
So reasoning is like automated logic aiming for truth preservation.
Exactly. It's about formal operations on representations. The heart of this is Newell and Simon's physical symbol system concept. Basically, intelligence emerges from a system that can manipulate physical patterns, symbols that stand for things in the world.
And these symbols aren't just random tokens, right? They have meaning, and the rules respect that meaning.
Precisely. And the big strength here is what they call systematicity. The internal structure is almost language-like. It has a combinatorial grammar, so the system can represent, say, John loves Mary.
It inherently has the bits and pieces needed to represent Mary loves John.
You got it. The same parts, just rearranged. It gives you this powerful, flexible basis for rational thought. Very elegant, in theory.
But then the challenger arrives. Connectionism. This sounds totally different. No neat symbols, just networks.
Yeah, you can think of it as modeling thought using artificial neural networks. Lots and lots of simple processing units, all interconnected. Inspired, obviously, by the structure of the brain.
So where is the knowledge stored in that kind of system, if it's not in explicit symbols?
Well, that's the key difference. Knowledge isn't localized in specific tokens. It's distributed.
Yeah.
It exists either in the patterns of activation across the network at a given moment, or, more permanently, it's encoded in the strengths of the connections, the weights between the units.
And getting those weights right must be the hard part.
Oh, absolutely. And connectionism had some false starts. What really gave it a massive boost later on was the development of the backpropagation algorithm.
Backprop, okay, I've definitely heard of that. That was for training.
Exactly. It provided an efficient way to train networks with multiple layers, deep networks, by figuring out how to adjust potentially millions of connection weights to get the network to perform a task better. Think of the NetTalk example.
Right. The system that learned to read text aloud, that was pretty amazing for its time.
It really was. But you see, this success created a huge philosophical headache for the classical symbolic folks.
How so?
Because connectionist representations are often messy. They're partial. They're distributed. They don't map cleanly onto the concepts we use in everyday language, like belief or desire or even cat.
So you can't just look inside the network and point to the cat symbol.
Not usually, no. It might be a complex pattern spread across hundreds of units. This really challenged that neat quasi-linguistic picture of the mind. Suddenly you've got this mountain of new questions, as one source puts it.
Yeah, I can see that. If the knowledge is just this diffuse pattern of weights, how do you ever really explain why the system made a particular decision? Can you debug it?
That's the crux of it. It forces this debate. Does genuine intelligence require step-by-step logical explanation, or is high performance enough? It's a tension that still exists today, frankly.
Okay, let's connect performance to action. If you manage to represent the world, symbolically or otherwise, the next step is actually doing something. How did early AI tackle planning and problem solving?
Right, so the field generally distinguishes between planning, figuring out a sequence of known actions to reach a goal, and problem solving, which is more about finding that sequence in an abstract search space.
And the big early landmark here has to be Newell and Simon again, with the general problem solver, or GPS.
Absolutely. GPS was groundbreaking. It came directly out of studying how humans solve puzzles, things like logic problems.
How did it work, roughly?
It used what they called the table of connections, the TOG. Basically, it looked at the difference between the current situation and the goal situation, and the TOG suggested operators actions that were relevant for reducing that specific difference. It's a classic means-ends analysis approach.
And then strips came along, building on GPS, but more for robotics.
That's right. Strips adapted these ideas for controlling robots. It became famous, or maybe infamous, for two big simplifying assumptions it made about the world.
Ah, yes, the closed world assumption.
Which means anything you can't explicitly prove true from the robot's current knowledge is assumed to be false. Very convenient, but not always realistic.
And the frame assumption.
That's the assumption that if an action description doesn't mention a particular feature of the world, that feature remains unchanged. Again, simplifies things hugely, but ignores side effects.
But even with these simplifications, planning hit a wall, didn't it? Something about sub-goals interfering.
Oh, definitely. That became the major bottleneck. Early planners were mostly linear. They assumed you could just achieve your sub-goals one after another in a sequence.
But life isn't like that. Doing step B might undo the condition you needed for step A.
Exactly. So these linear planners were constantly having to backtrack, undo steps, and regenerate huge chunks of the plan every time they detected an interaction. It was incredibly inefficient.
A computational nightmare, basically. Fixing one thing breaks three others.
Pretty much. This led to a kind of crisis in planning research until a deceptively simple idea emerged. Non-linear planning. The NOA8 system from 1975 is a key example.
Nonlinear, meaning it doesn't assume a strict order from the start.
Right. It's also called least commitment planning.
Mm-hmm.
The core idea is don't decide on the order of steps unless you absolutely have to, usually because two steps interfere with each other.
So you maintain a partial order, only adding constraints as needed.
Precisely. This dramatically shrinks the search space you need to explore because you're not constantly committing to orderings that might turn out to be wrong later. It was a huge leap forward.
That's clever. An engineering fix for a cognitive style bottleneck. Okay, so planning gets smarter, but what about the content? The planners needed something to plan with. This brings us to the knowledge dilemma.
Yeah, the realization dawned that even the cleverest planner is useless without knowledge about the world. In AI, knowledge is defined quite functionally. It's whatever information is needed to support intelligent reasoning.
And it's not just the information itself, but how it's organized, right? Structure and function.
Absolutely. The structure is a list, a set, a network. And the function, what operations can you perform on it, are intertwined. You can't separate them.
So what were some of the classic ways AI tried to represent knowledge? The sources mentioned semantic networks.
Right. Think of nodes representing objects or concepts, and labeled links representing relationships between them, like a robin is a bird or a bird has part wing. Simple, intuitive.
But their power depended on how the system actually used those links.
Exactly. You needed a clear process model, the reasoning program, to define what inferences you could actually draw from that network structure. Just drawing the diagram wasn't enough.
Then came frames, which sound a bit more structured.
Yeah, Minsky's idea. Frames are like data structures for representing stereotypical situations or objects. Think of a chair frame. It would have slots for things like number of legs, material, function.
And the key innovation was default values.
Yes. The frame could specify that a chair typically has 4 legs, but if you encounter a specific 3-legged chair, you can just fill in that slot with 3, overriding the default. It mimics how humans use assumptions and handle exceptions. Very powerful.
This whole drive to capture knowledge led directly to the first wave of expert systems, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
These systems, often built in the 70s and early 80s, were typically based on logic, using lots of if-then rules. Things like, if the patient has a fever and a rash, then suspect measles.
And they used inference mechanisms like forward or backward chaining to apply these rules.
Right. But the crucial insight, looking back, is that their success wasn't really down to sophisticated reasoning engines. The inference mechanisms were often quite simple.
Their power came from the knowledge base itself.
Overwhelmingly, yes. It was the quality and completeness of the rules, painstakingly gathered from human experts by knowledge engineers, that made them work. The knowledge was king.
But they had a massive Achilles heel, brittleness.
Oh, absolutely. That's the word everyone uses. Expert systems could give remarkably good advice for problems squarely within their narrow domain. Step even slightly outside that depth.
Then they fall apart spectacularly.
Utterly. Because they lack basic common sense, any understanding of the world beyond their encoded rules, The classic example, mentioned in the sources, is the medical diagnosis system.
The one that asks for the patient's gender and birth date again on a follow-up visit.
That's the one. It has no concept that gender is stable or that birth date is fixed. It just knows it needs those inputs for certain rules. It highlights a profound lack of background understanding.
It's funny, but also kind of scary if you imagine deploying that logic widely. This brittleness seems like a perfect lead-in to machine learning, right? The need for systems that can adapt and maybe learn some common sense.
Exactly, the focus shifts. In machine learning, you have a learning element that observes performance and modifies the performance element based on feedback, hopefully improving it over time.
And a key type here is inductive learning, trying to infer a general rule or function from specific example.
Right, you see inputs and corresponding outputs, and you try to figure out the systematic relationship between them.
And the guiding principle for choosing the best explanation, the best function, often comes down to Occam's razor.
Pretty much. The idea that all else being equal, the simplest hypothesis that fits the data is probably the best bet. Simpler explanations tend to generalize better to new, unseen examples.
This gets formalized in computational learning theory, right? Things like minimum description length or pack learning.
Exactly. Pack learning, probably approximately correct learning, provides mathematical guarantees about how many examples you need to be confident that your alerted hypothesis is close to the true underlying function, assuming you prefer simpler hypotheses.
Okay, so that's learning from labeled examples. What about learning from just trial and error? Like rewards and punishments, that's reinforcement learning, or RL.
Yes, RL is crucial when you don't get told the correct answer directly. You just get feedback, maybe a reward signal like points in a game or a penalty if your robot crashes. You have to figure out which actions lead to good outcomes over time.
How does it work under the hood?
Often, it uses models like Markov decision processes, MDPs, to represent the states, actions, and rewards. And a key technique is temporal difference learning, or TD learning.
TD learning, what's the core idea there?
It's clever. Instead of waiting until the very end of a long sequence of actions to figure out which ones were good, TD learning lets the system update its estimate of a state's value based on the value of the next state it observes. It learns from transitions, bootstrapping its estimates, much more efficient.
So it's constantly adjusting its expectations based on what just happened.
You got it. And the sources also make a really important point about how background knowledge can supercharge learning.
Right, the inductive logic programming example.
Yeah, ILP shows that if you give the learning system some relevant background knowledge, say logical definitions for concepts like parent or female, it can learn much more complex concepts, like grandparent or daughter, from far fewer examples. Knowledge provides huge leverage.
Which feels like it circles back to the knowledge representation problem, but in a learning context.
Fascinating. So this brings us towards the end of our period, where some researchers started questioning the whole focus on internal representation, moving towards embodiment.
Exactly, a sort of counter-revolution in a way. The new robotics movement started arguing that maybe complex internal models and symbolic planning weren't always necessary or even desirable.
Action becomes primary.
That's the idea. It's often summed up by the 007 principle.
The James Bond principle, what's that?
It basically says, figure out how little you need to know or compute internally by cleverly exploiting the structure that's already out there in the real world, including your own body. Let the world do some of the work. Use the world as its own model instead of building a complex internal replica.
Precisely. Why build a detailed internal map if you can just navigate by looking around? This was a direct challenge to the classical Sense Plan Act model. Rodney Brooks's work is iconic here.
With the subsumption architecture?
Yes. He built robots like Genghis with layered competencies. The lowest layer might just handle basic movement and obstacle avoidance. Higher layers, like wandering, are added on top, but they don't necessarily override the lower ones, they subsume them. If the wandering layer fails, the robot can still avoid bumping into things. Robustness through decomposition.
Very different philosophy. And this bottom-up emergent approach connects to artificial life, or A-life.
Definitely. A-life uses similar bottom-up thinking, often employing things like genetic algorithms inspired by biological evolution to synthesize life-like behaviors. You don't program the behavior directly, you let it evolve.
Like evolving controllers for walking robots.
Exactly. Evolving locomotion for a simulated insect is a classic A-life example. You set up the evolutionary process, define fitness, and let solutions emerge.
But evolution in simulation led to some Weird results, didn't it? The sources talk about a really counterintuitive phenomenon.
Ah, yes. Goal regression.
Mm.
This is fascinating and maybe a bit unsettling. It came out of work by Ackley and Littman.
What happened?
They were evolving simulated agents. The agents had an action network for behaving and a separate evaluation network that was supposed to learn what situations were good or bad, like avoiding predators is good.
Okay, makes sense.
But what they found was that if the action network got really good at its job, say, becoming incredibly skilled at instinctively dodging predators, it actually shielded the evaluation network from negative feedback. The agent just never got caught.
So the part of the system responsible for knowing what's good or bad stopped getting useful training data.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because the agent was surviving perfectly through instinct, the evolutionary pressure on the evaluation network relaxed, and it started to decay, to drift.
Leading to crazy judgments.
Yeah. The sources describe agents whose internal evaluators eventually evolved to assign positive value to dangerous situations, like being near a predator. It didn't matter functionally because the action network was still flawlessly avoiding danger, but the internal goal or understanding became totally corrupted.
Wow. The system's actions were perfect, but its values decayed into absurdity because they weren't needed for survival anymore. That's quite a finding.
It really makes you think. Okay, one last area the sources touched on before 1996 is creativity. How could machines be creative?
The definition used here seems to be about novel combinations or, interestingly, transformations of conceptual space.
Right, like non-Euclidean geometry emerging by challenging one of Euclid's axioms.
Yeah.
Or the example of Kekule figuring out the benzene ring, the sources suggest a transformation from thinking about open strings to closed loops.
And there were early AI programs that showed sparks of this, like AM, the automatic mathematician.
Lynette's AM program is a classic. It wasn't explicitly programmed with high-level math knowledge. It started with basic set theory concepts and a bunch of heuristics, rules of thumb about what might be interesting to explore.
And it generated significant mathematical ideas on its own.
Remarkably, yes. It discovered concepts like prime numbers, conjectured Goldbach's conjecture that every even integer greater than 2 is the sum of two primes, and explored other fruitful areas just by applying its heuristics to combine and modify its initial concepts, a form of computational discovery.
So, looking back at this whole journey up to 96, we've gone from the mind as this neat, logical, symbol-manipulating machine
To seeing intelligence as potentially emerging from messy distributed networks, or even from simple embodied interactions with the world, sometimes with unexpected consequences like goal regression.
It really underscores that studying AI forces us to constantly refine what we even mean by mind or intelligence.
Absolutely. And you see that recurring tension throughout.
Yeah.
The drive for simplicity and theoretical elegance like Occam's razor or POC learning, wanting the simplest model.
Clashing with the harsh reality of brittleness, where those simple models often lack the deep common sense grounding needed for the real world.
It's a fundamental balancing act.
Which leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, stemming directly from that goal regression idea. If a system, maybe even a person, becomes incredibly proficient at a task purely through instinct or deeply ingrained habit, does the need to consciously understand why they're doing it or what the ultimate goal means actually fade away?
Could that lead to the internal goals or values associated with the task decaying, becoming nonsensical, simply because flawless performance makes them irrelevant for success?
What might that imply about our own human need for continuous learning, reflection, and reevaluating our purposes, even in areas where we feel highly skilled? Something to chew on until next time.